Hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's event with the title Ex Post Evaluation of the Implementation of the Deep Comprehensive Free Trade Agreements between the European Union and its member states and Georgia and Moldova. I am Mihai. I am an economist from the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies. And today's presenter is Tinatin Akhvlediani from the Center for European Policy Studies. And this event is part of the series events of seminars in international economics that are organized by the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies in cooperation with the Research Center International Economics. And these seminars in international economics are intended to be a forum for presentations and discussion of current research findings in the field of international economics with three major focuses of international trade and trade policy, foreign direct investment, and international migration. And in order to give you some housekeeping rules, we usually have presentations of about 30 to 40 minutes max, 40 minutes, or even sometimes it's extended to 50, 60 minutes. And then it is followed by a Q&A session of about 20 minutes so that everyone can unmute him or herself to ask the question and raise comments, and so that we can have an interactive discussion at the end. But since I talked with Tina, you can always ask your questions in the chat function, and I will read those questions, and if the question is important and related to the narration of the slides and the presentation, I will immediately ask the question. Otherwise, I will collect all the questions for the Q&A session. But if you also think that the question is very important, you can also unmute yourself and ask the question during the presentation. And after the event, we will send you an online survey so that you could also give us your evaluation about our seminars so that we can improve in the future with the topics and also with how to hold these seminars. And it's an important note that we will record this session and we will upload it on our wiiw YouTube channel. And I should say that the slides will be also available on the wiiw website so that you can read it later, but we also upload it on the chat function. My colleague will, I think, yeah, she already uploaded in the chat function so that you are able to go through the slides already now, or if you have any question in the slides, you can return to the slides that you have. And in order to introduce the speaker, Dr. Tinatin Akhvlediani is a research fellow and acting head of financial markets and institution unit at the Center for European Policy Studies, or CEPS, which is a think tank based in Brussels. And actually, Tina had also a research visit a few years ago at our institute. And prior to that, actually, I know Tina since I was teaching a course at Warsaw University. And later on, she graduated from her PhD studies at the University of Warsaw. And she also did other studies at the European Economic Studies from the College of Europe. And she also holds a bachelor degree in economics from Tbilisi University. And during her work and her career, she did lots of different studies for different European institutions, European Parliament, European Commission, European Committee of the Regions, and several other international organizations. Actually, she is frequently on TVs, and she has several different types of interviews with international TVs like BBC, like also Bloomberg, like Deutsche Welle, Voice of America. And she's very active on the policy making of EU with regards to Georgia and also Eastern Europe. So it's a pleasure to have you, Tina, again at our institute, but virtually. And I follow you on Twitter, I follow you on LinkedIn, I follow your work. It's a pleasure to have you, and it's very good to see another work of yours. And I'm looking forward to what you will present for us. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mihai, for this very warm welcome. I hope you can all hear me well. It was definitely my pleasure to have this research visit at Wiiw years ago now that really contributed the progress on my back then PhD thesis. And indeed, Mihai was my teacher, in fact, at the University of Warsaw. And then I even took over the course that he was teaching. But right now, I think we are both away from the University of Warsaw, unfortunately, for the time being. Maybe there will be another overlap in the past. Indeed, I'm very happy to be here today and actually to present the study that we have delivered at CEPS. It was a consortium basically led by CEPS, and we had local partners in Moldova and in Georgia because, as you will see in the slides, this was the study that took around 2 years, and this was the study around the trade agreements, which are unique in their type. These are these deep and comprehensive free trade areas that European Union has so far only with these 3 countries, Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. And given their comprehensive nature, the study is quite technical. So I will try to maybe summarize some general findings so far we could find. But while I present, as Mihai mentioned, if you have any questions or some clarifications you would like to make during the presentation, also do come in, unmute yourself, and just do let me know. Otherwise, all of the follow-up questions, then we will have a Q&A session, and then I will try my best to respond to these questions later. So without further ado, let me start sharing my screen and starting the presentation. Just let me double check with Mihai. Is it all good? Do you see it? Okay, great. Et voila. So you see the title. So maybe just a few words is that this study was delivered it was commissioned by the European Commission, DG Trade, and it contributes basically in the review process of the European Commission's trade and neighborhood policies. And here I'm presenting the studies on 2 different countries, Georgia and Moldova. These are 2 separate reports, and I know Mihai shared with you, but this PowerPoint presentation basically provides the summary on both of the reports, but I will be referring to 2 different documents. Now, the contents for us for the next half an hour or 40 minutes, I will very briefly review the purpose and the scope of the studies, and then we'll present the main findings, conclusions, and recommendations. Now, within the purpose of the evaluation, as I said, these agreements are really comprehensive. They have really various chapters, and they're quite deep and comprehensive. Sorry, that was a question, or I can go ahead? Probably I can go ahead. Our basically aim and our task was to find the effects of the agreements on economic, social, and also sustainable areas. So that is quite challenging in itself. And also to respond to the questions, to what extent have these agreements been relevant to the current trade and economic needs and challenges of the European Union, as well as Georgia and Moldova, and to assess the extent to which the DCFTAs had contributed to efficiently and effectively reach the objectives set out in the association agreements, and also the objectives of EU's trade and neighborhood policies. Now, it's a very important point that I here clarify. So DCFTAs are parts of the association agreements signed between the European Union and Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova. So they formed a part of this very large agreements. Also, maybe a note here in case you have the question on that, why we have not conducted the ex post evaluation on Ukraine, because in line with the better regulation principle of the European Commission, the assessment comes after the agreement has been in place for 5 years, which was the case for Georgia and Moldova, but not for Ukraine, because the DCFTA with Ukraine came into force in 2016. So this is why we've only provided so far the assessment on these 2 countries. Now, in terms of the scope, again, in line with the better regulation principle, we assessed the effectiveness, impact, efficiency, coherence, and relevance of the agreements. Well, the geographical coverage, this covers Georgia, Moldova, the European Union. Also, some clarifications. Georgia has 2 breakaway regions, which are not part of the study because the DCFTA is not applied in these breakaway regions. However, in Moldova, we included Transnistria as the DCFTA covers this breakaway region. And also for the trade analysis, mostly we have considered other countries which are the major trade partners or which have been major trade partners, such as the UK, the countries members of the CEFTA, EFTA, Eurasian Economic Union, EU, CIS, which stands for the Commonwealth of Independent States, and China. Now, with the period of the study, which is also important, it covers basically the 5 years after the entry into the force of the agreements, which is September 2014 up to the end of 2019. The other things that we basically also excluded into taking into consideration the year 2020, mostly because of the distortion and biases into the data because of the outbreak of the pandemic. But again, the key objective of the study was to measure the effects within the 5 years after the entry into force of the agreements. And among the groups affected, we really referred and considered all the areas across economic sectors, all workers and the working population, rural and urban, and we will see that briefly in the next slides. Now, also, I've included a slide just to maybe have a guidelines how to read these lengthy studies. So we've done quantitative and qualitative assessments, and also we've invested quite a lot of efforts in conducting stakeholder consultations, which obviously fed our qualitative assessment. And so the study is divided into several parts, into 3 major parts. So the part A, you have evaluation context, and part B is the evaluation findings divided into different chapters. And then part C, you will read the conclusions and recommendations. And also it's important that for all the technical or all the data supplements, we have quite lengthy annexes per studies. So this is basically the annexes cover every task and every chapter. They just complement with more data and more explanations. There's a lot of desk research also put into the annexes if you would like to learn more, so you can refer to the annexes. And an important part of the study was also setting up the inventories of the legislative approximation, and these are provided as separate documents to each of the final reports. Now, why I'm referring to it, because within their nature of association agreements and DCFTAs, legislative approximation is a very key part of it. So this one, I mean, putting forward the inventories on to what extent has been legislative approximation conducted, what is the progress. That obviously took a lot of our efforts, our local team's efforts, but that was very key to basically assess where did we get until now in terms of implementing these comprehensive and broad agreements. Now, let me start with the findings. I think I've defined more or less the context of the study and objectives. And let me start with economic findings, because we are talking about the trade agreement. Now, the overall, I will go country by country. So the overall picture in Georgia is that basically trading goods between Georgia and the EU have remained largely unchanged since 2014. And I will explain why. So this is because Georgia has been following very liberal trade policy. Even before signing of the agreement with the European Union, Georgia has liberalized its trade. And so the remaining tariffs and trade barriers were very little. And the existing barriers, trade barriers, mostly refer to the non-tariff barriers such as SPS and TBT, which really takes time to get, to get absorbed and to get overcome. So this is what we actually see in the data. In that sense, the signing itself of the agreement did not have a direct, effect boosting the trade. No, the EU share is roughly the same as it was in 2014. We will see that in the next slides. However, trade in services has expanded more steadily. But again, because services reflect a lot of other areas, level of digitalization, all that, it's very difficult to subtract and really single out the effects of the agreements, direct effects. FDIs have remained very dynamic, especially given Georgia's minuscule size in terms of economic, in terms of economy in general, and GDP. Georgia is a small open economy, but given its size, FDIs are quite dynamic. But this seems to be, again, more influenced by the construction of pipelines and also exploiting tax saving schemes and transfer tax saving schemes more rather than transfer of industrial know-how or the trade-related investments. So it's difficult at this stage to detect any direct impact from the DCFTA on reducing regional inequalities. And also, as I said, because of Georgia's trade liberalization much before of the signing the trade agreement, CG model based estimates does not basically find very large effects on macroeconomic indicators. Now, with Moldova, trade has been much more dynamic than with Georgia since 2014 in terms of both in trades in goods and services. Although FDIs have been less dynamic, but the distribution of FDIs are more related to basically trade performances. As in the case of Georgia, it's difficult to detect the impact of the DCFTAs on reducing regional inequalities. And also the estimates based on CG modeling on main macroeconomic indicators are also limited for Moldova. So this is a very overall general picture. Let me zoom in a bit. So what basically happened? First of all, while working on these countries, it's worth mentioning that different sources of the data give quite different results. So we've considered that, and you will see that in the report, different sources, then we obviously relied on the European sources. However, this biases in the trade data is something to be flagged. So the Georgia's perspective, as you can see, basically on these columns, right? The growth. Oh, sorry for this. The growth columns. We see that the growth was not that extensive after 2014, but we see the exports to the EU have been expanded quite largely before 2014, starting from 2008, and this is very much linked to Georgia's trade liberalization itself before signing the association agreement. And also Georgia has been a beneficiary of the GSP plus, so that also is reflected into the growth. And so when Georgia signed the agreement, there was not much trade barriers that have been basically removed due to the trade agreement because a lot was liberalized before. So that's what we see in the data. Also, there is obviously EU's perspective. From the EU's perspective, trade with Georgia remains rather marginal. It's basically, less than 1% in both EU's imports, extra EU imports and extra EU exports. So this is a very small country to be considered for European Union's economic interests. Now, with trade with Moldova, you see much more dynamics before as well as after the signing of the agreement. You see on the tables that the growth was really large, both in imports and exports before as well as after. We see the import growing larger after the signing of the agreement, and the export growth remained really steady. So for Moldova had more trade barriers in place. So the agreement has indeed removed tariff barriers and also like some other trade barriers, so that we see picking up in the data as well. So from the EU's perspective, again, Moldova's share in the EU's extra EU imports and exports is slightly larger than Georgia's, but again, it's very tiny. It's less than 1%. So the same picture here applies basically. Let me move in terms of what are the basic, the groups that these countries are exporting to the European Union. This is important because we see that the diversification across the different products is not that high until now. For Georgia, it was exporting the raw materials before signing the agreements, and actually it remains, it keeps exporting these raw materials, mostly the copper ores and concentrates, fertilizers, fertilizers, and nuts. Well, basically, you see the nuts only 6% in 2019. Here we mean mainly hazelnuts. Before that year, before 2019, there was more exports on that product category, but then there was some invasion of the insects, and this hazelnut exports from Georgia was actually substituted by Turkish exports to the European Union. This is just a note to clarify, because if the people usually expected to have higher share on the hazelnuts, well, that has been dropped more recently. And also not so much into the beverages, spirits, and vinegar. I mean, the wine, Georgia is a wine exporter, but exporting wines to the EU remains basically costly, and this is why you don't see much of a share here in this product category. So when it comes to Moldova, Moldova has basically the product categories are more diverse, let's say, than in Georgia's case, because in Georgia's case, nearly half comes on copper ores and concentrates. So in that sense, for Moldova, it's more diversified, but insulated wires, cables, other electronic conductors still take 1/4 of Moldova's exports. We also have sunflower seeds and some wheat exports. But again, we do not see much of, final manufactured products into the export category. So this is basically the main finding on analyzing the main export categories to the European Union, to make it briefly summarized. Now, in terms of the imports from the EU, they very much, resemble the EU's the structure of the EU exports to the overall EU's EU's exports generally in the other countries. So we have mainly petroleum oils, medicaments, that is very much expected, motor cars and motor vehicles. Also, I shall say that Georgia specializes in importing the cars and then repairing them and then exporting. Most of the cars are imported actually not from the EU, from the other countries, from Asia, Japan, China, but also from the EU. This has been going on. So this is why you see this product category popping up there. In terms of the imports from the EU in Moldova, so basically we have very similar product groups, the medicaments, motor cars, but there's also here insulated wires that Moldova is really specializing in importing and then exporting. So that's the product category that we basically see here. Now, the relative importance of the bilateral trading goods, this is as well important because we wanted to check whether the agreements have had any trade diversion effects. Right? So we checked in terms of Georgia, we checked Georgia's main partners, both in exports and in imports. So in exports, mostly we have Azerbaijan, Russia, and China. And we didn't really find any reduction into Georgia's exports to those three main countries. In fact, the share of Georgia's exports to these three dimensions, including Russia, has been expanded nearly twice within the past 10 years since 2009. So that has not, basically the conclusion is that the DCFTA didn't really create any trade divergence in Georgia's exports. The same picture is detected in Georgia's imports. Here we have the three key partners, Turkey, Russia, and China. And also imports from these three countries have been expanding from 28% to 36%. So this is not a large increase, but again, there is we have not registered any drop. When it comes to Moldova, we neither see here any considerable trade diversion effects with its non-EU trade partners. On the export side, Moldova's major trade partners are Turkey, Belarus, Ukraine, and basically their share is dropped, but the drop is not that large. We see the 3 percentage point drop. And in terms of Moldova's imports, we have Ukraine, China, and Russia, and the share basically fluctuated around 30%, so roughly the same. But EU share has definitely expanded in terms for Moldova from 52% to 66% in Moldova's exports. And also we have a 6 percentage point increase in Moldova's imports. So the picture is that for Georgia, EU share did not expand much, but it neither led to the trade diversion with Georgia's non-EU trade partners. In Moldova, EU share has really expanded. However, this did not materialize on an expense of the trade divergence with other non-EU trade partners. So this is basically the main takeaway from here. Now, macroeconomic and budgetary effects, here that's where the CGE modeling exercise really comes in. So we do have some estimates here, but again, in terms of the shares of Georgia's GDP, it's just really limited. So I do not want to basically flag any of this because they're limited. The same is on Moldova's side. Probably the only one I would rather flag this is the contribution to GDP, 8 million on Georgia's side and 49 million on Moldova's side. So this is nearly 0.5% for Moldova and less than 1% for Georgia. So there was a higher impact on Moldova's GDP, which is very much expected, given that trade has really expanded between Moldova and the EU, basically. But other than that, I think basically the other things maybe I should flag is the notice of basically some impact in decline in fiscal tax receipts, which is again very much foreseen because there was a removal of the trade barriers and there was more trade barriers removed on Moldova's side. And this is why we have more reduction in tax receipts, which is worth around 8 million for Moldova's side and only 2 million for Georgia's side, because as I said, Georgia has removed main trade barriers before signing the agreement.
May I ask one question here?
Sure, Mihai.
So here for Georgia, so you said because the trade liberalization started before the DCFTA, the impact is smaller, or even the impact on GDP is negligible, right? So what if you move this DCFTA variable to 2013 or 12? Do you see an impact? Do you see a larger impact?
I don't think we would see to 2012 and 13, given the trade statistics that I've presented before. Maybe they would make sense to move the timing 10 years before, so basically 5 years more. So let's put it that way, like to 2008-9, that would probably could have given us some larger impact.
Okay.
But not 2012 and 13, no, because that was close to the signing of the agreement, and I think most of the trade barriers were eliminated by then.
And one more question, because I don't know, when do these countries became members of the WTO?
For Georgia's case, that was early 2000s. If I'm not mistaken, this is the same with Moldova's. I actually do not remember precise years on it.
So the trade liberalization of Georgia started then, but for Moldova it didn't start.
Well, the Moldova, you cannot say it has a very conservative trade policy, not so much, but the Georgia liberalized its trade vis-a-vis all its trade partners, including the European Union. So Moldova has been simply more careful and selective with the trade partners. That's what we're basically seeing here. But also Georgia's liberalization was very much unilateral. So going beyond the WTO requirements, that was Georgia's strategy to attract a lot of investments and very much linked to the revolution. So that was a bit, Georgia was its own mission.
Okay, thank you.
My pleasure. Sure. So the user view preferences, TRQs, and market access. So we have we also gathered some evidence on that. So the rate of use of preferences by Georgia is not low, but it could be higher. Basically, it's lower. It's below the average of the other EU partners from the same region. So the use of preferences by Moldova is, for instance, higher than it is in Georgia. And the same refers to basically the agricultural products, because Georgia is producing some agricultural products and could have been the preferences utilized probably better. And then the TRQs, so TRQs stand for tariff rate quotas. So the Georgia has tariff rate quotas on garlic, and also on several fruits and vegetables. If I'm not mistaken, this is peach. But again, we have not seen that these tariff rate quotas were even exploited to the close to the limit. And as an explanation, we know that China is so far providing EU market with sufficient garlic, so no room so much for Georgia to provide the garlic. But anyways, TRQs were not exhausted by Georgia within these years after signing the DCFTA. So for Moldova's side, there is extensive use of preferences, also in the animal products, animal fat, vegetable products, that has been expanding. So the use of quotas were much higher than in Georgia in grapes and plums. In these categories, they were basically up to the limit nearly, and that has already been taken into account by the European Union. And actually this year, the tariff rate quotas have revised and expanded for Moldova. So Moldova can now export more grapes than before, but this is not mentioned in a study, I think, because again, the period for our analysis was up to 2019. And so in terms of the EU exporters, they also benefited from the removal of tariffs in agricultural products, and the use of TRQs and preferences by the EU exporters was really high, nearly up to 100% in pork, poultry, dairy, and sugar products. So this is the products that the EU is sending to Moldova. Now, trade in services is a very interesting bit of this study because the DCFTAs are mainly focused on the trades in goods. So when it comes to the trade in services, it is liberalized more from Georgia's and Moldova's side than from the EU. So the EU is keeping numbers of reservations on several sectors. So the liberalization can definitely be further expanded from the EU side. But even though there are the reservations in the services sector, in the data, we actually found quite some dynamics, particularly for Georgia's services exports. So in fact, the EU has become the largest partner in services trade for Georgia. And there is actually there is no trade deficit. This is the only sector where Georgia does not have a trade deficit with the EU. So the services has been really expanding quite a lot. This mainly refers to the services of travel, which is tourism, obviously, ICT services, and also the transport. Well, transport is also related a bit to the development of tourism in the countries, and also the import has been growing. We see again same ICT services, transport, travel, and government services. That's what we gathered in the data. And also in terms of the relative importance of the expansion of services trade, I mean, DCFTA didn't lead to trade diversion with the third countries. So Georgia's exports to all reference countries basically are not definitely dropping, and they're expanding in a way. So there was no trade diversion detected here. Now, with the Moldova, the EU services is basically negligible from the EU's perspective, and the same is true for Georgia. But for Moldova, EU is the largest trade partner in services. There are no major shift in the structure or in the concentration in trade services after signing of the agreements. But we see same product categories popping up actually as the major categories for the services trade, like transport, travel, ICT services. On Moldova side, we also have business and manufacturing services identified. And the same categories on the ICT imports, on the services imports actually from the EU. Here what we found while considering potential trade diversion, what we actually found is that DCFTA has led the reorientation of Moldova services exports and imports from Russia to the EU. So the drop is really significant. So the Russia share is nearly halved, and at the same time, EU share is really increased, while the share of with the services trade with other trade countries are not really dropped. So that is only characteristic for Russia. So that's potentially a trade diversion here in trade and services. And also,
sorry,
sure?
One question. So the ICT is also connected to the tourism, that people move and use phones?
No, it's not really. So these are the ICT services that could be provided by ICT professionals. This is not really related directly to the phone use, but that could be connected to the openness of the countries, actually both of the countries, to host the people. So there are a lot of people that were coming and working from the country and therefore providing ICT services abroad. And this is what we actually read in here. So tourism, indirectly related, that country got open towards the foreigners and the travel and tourism. Yes.
And what is the size of the ICT service in comparison to, the exporting services compared to exporting goods?
Export in services compared to exporting goods, right? In general to the European Union?
Right, or in total.
The numbers, sure. I mean, exports and goods obviously in the nominal terms are higher. As I finish the presentation, I think I have a slide on it. Just let me find it so I can present the numbers. But services are not as high, obviously not as high, not comparable high to the trade in goods. But a good point to mention here is both Georgia and Moldova are services-based economies. So around 40% of their economies come on the services. And what I mean here, services for both of the countries, especially for Georgia, this is tourism, leisure, hospitality, these kind of services, repair services. So the Moldova has higher share in manufacturing, but still the services share is actually quite high. So that's, I think the services is picking up given the structures of these two countries. That's what we see. But let me also find exact numbers after I'm done with the presentation so we can screen that too.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Now with the trade in services, okay, so I've also included one slide on that, on the data discrepancies. This is simply just to flag that the trade and the data in services is very difficult to gather. So we had the data that was initially not publicly available. We really struggled to actually collect it, especially the services trade data and the destination at the same time. And yeah, there were a lot of, we had a lot of question marks, but again, we had to work based on the data we had. But as the services pick up and improve, I hope the trade data and services should also be basically improved. Now, foreign direct investments. So again, we've done here the mirror statistics exercise, and that was definitely worth it because probably this is the part where we found the most of data discrepancies. For instance, in Georgia's side, FDIs reported by national sources, by Georgian sources, were around 4 times larger than the FDIs reported by the Eurostat. For Moldova side, the difference was twice larger, but still, I mean, this is a big bias. So then we partly relied on the Georgian statistics, where there was an absence of EU statistics, but where there was the Eurostat statistics, we just relied on it. So, I mean, from the EU's perspective, Georgia's share in the EU's total FDIs is really negligible. Again, similarly to trade, is less than 1%. But the EU is the largest investor in Georgia, sourcing around 60% of the inward FDI stocks. And this share is important that it's actually larger than EU's trade share, which is roughly around 23–24%. So you can see how much EU FDIs really played the role. Now, within 2014 and 19, the FDIs from the EU into Georgia grew considerably. Well, not doubled, but nearly double so. But they are, as I said in the beginning, linked to the construction of the pipelines. So we could not really link those inflows of the investments directly to the DCFTA. And we also had some question marks because we found, I think this is the next slide, some countries who are major source of the investments in Georgia. These are the countries which are also kind of known for tax evasion. So and the havens, tax haven countries. So there are the questions also there. And also the DCFTA, we didn't find any evidence that the DCFTA has had any negative effects on investments from basically no-new countries. So no-new countries share remained stable around remaining 40%. Now, with Moldova, the same picture, the country is negligible from the EU's perspective, but as in the case of Georgia, EU is the largest investor in Moldova, sourcing around 70% of inward FDIs. This is again larger than the EU's trade share, which is around 54%, but the difference is larger. Okay, I'll go on. I hope this was not a question. If there was, yeah, please communicate with us later. Now, in 2000, in this assessment period, within the 5 years, the EU FDIs have increased indeed, but the increase was much more modest than there was the increase in for Georgia's case. And more than 2/3 of the EU FDI are in financial and insurance activities, wholesale and retail trade and manufacturing. And as in the case of Georgia, there is no evidence that basically there is any reorientation of the FDIs from the non-EU countries, including the FDIs from Russia, which remain, still considerable, up to 20%. So that's basically, I think, brings this overall picture. And also maybe some numbers for Mahdi's questions on the services. We can see on this slide that trade and services exports, for instance, have doubled from 499 million to 807 million. And as I said, mostly travel, ICT, and transport. So this is the numbers on the services I could basically refer to, which is much lower than the trade in goods, because there we speak in terms of billions, not in terms of millions. So this is much fewer. But I think in terms of the maybe to overall, summarize. I don't want to go through this slide again. We saw that, for Georgia, the trade effects were rather modest for the given reasons, although there is impact on FDIs. Difficult to link that impact to the DCFTAs effects directly. We see services picking up, and that requires definitely more research. In the main macroeconomic indicators, the effect is limited. On Moldova's side, we definitely see the effects on trade, which is promising. On the FDIs, there are some increase, but again, it's more modest than for Georgia. And the services trade is also very important for Moldova. That's, I think, in a nutshell, this part of basically economic impact. And I see that I took nearly 40 minutes to go only over that. So let me be a bit faster on the other parts, but this was the key part of the agreement. So we also studied the effects on SMEs and consumers, which is also a key part of the agreement. So basically, we selected some sectors where we would analyze the SMEs. That was a textile and apparel in both countries. And we see some dynamics in here. So for the Georgian companies, they basically specialize in knitting and crocheting. So this is the final line of just finalizing the processes. So trade is mainly conducted under the inward processing procedure. With the apparel sector, the growth was sourced mainly by large enterprises, and SMEs actually have reoriented their exports towards non-EU countries in this sector. And the trade in textile has not seen actually much changes. Now, maybe I didn't introduce why we picked that sector, because we wanted to analyze the sectors that are not systematically covered by the studies and that are also growing. So the sector itself has been growing large, but as you see in the slide, the growth was not really directed or reflected in the expanding growth with the EU. So it's actually outside of the EU. With Moldova, it's rather a modest impact on trade flows, because the trade in that sector was entirely liberalized before signing of the basically DCFTA. And the important part we found in the stakeholder consultations was that SMEs have reported that the agreement has actually led to the introduction of corporate social responsibility, human rights, and all the sort of standards and their adoption into the practice. So that was, I think, very interesting finding. And also we took the ICT sector to study. Again, I said, because given the structures of the economies, they're services-based economies, and ICT is a very important sector for the both of the countries. And we saw, and definitely it was worth, because we saw that Georgia's exports increased within basically this period of analysis nearly 9 times, 9-fold increase. Again, we're talking the starting point was very minuscule, only around 2 million, and now it's 27 million, but the increase is really considerable. And so Georgia's, as I said previously, Georgia's trade balance with EU in the ICT sector has actually turned up positive. So that was important for the country. For Moldova's side, the increase was not as large. However, Moldova in both ICT imports and exports, we have quite large shares with the European Union. It's like more than 60%, which is really considerable. And ICT imports grew more than ICT exports of Moldova to the EU. This is just the dynamics, just to draw the comparison basically with Georgia. And also we collected some stories. I don't think I have time to go through that. Maybe my quick summary would be that in terms of exporting, along with the implementation of the agreements and legislative approximation, adopting the SPS mainly here, there are new products that both of the countries are exporting to the European Union. So for Georgia, there are new products, fresh fruits, vegetables, jams and canned vegetables, there are dried fruits, and these are the new products added there. However, and the growth is really considerable. In some cases, this is double digit, this is more than 200%. But when it comes to the actual values in nominal terms, they're very, very limited still. And another one is pet furniture. That is a very interesting case study on Georgia's side. That actually the exports in pet furniture was like really grown quite a lot. But this is only one company that is, to our knowledge, of Chinese origin, that really took the benefits of having access to the EU market, and the growth was basically very, very large. On Moldova's side, wines and honey. So the wine was the product category where Moldova redirected, I think, its export, especially facing Russian embargoes. So EU was a very good destination to have. With the honey, again, the Moldova has received the right to export the honey because this is a product of animal origin, right? So this is a new development. The nominal values are still very much limited. However, there is a potential for this. And also we see the increase in fresh fruits and vegetables. And as I said earlier, the TRQs in these product categories are really nearly used to the full capacity. So there is an expansion on Moldova's side in these product groups. With the case studies on consumers, what we basically aimed is to study to what extent, adoption of the EU legislation and in particular SPS and HASP standards in milk and dairy products would have had some, benefits. Now, the result is that simply, again, because the way dairy products are created and supplied into the domestic markets, it was very difficult for us to assess this. This is because the raw milk is produced mainly in the household or smallholder firms, which are exempted from applying basically the standards. Large companies, we saw that they're very much on the way to adopt the standards. But when we tracked down the changes into the prices and into the consumer safety or welfare through the stakeholder consultations, because that's very difficult to quantify, but we had several statistical analyses on prices, imports, directions, and all that. It was very difficult to detect actually any changes linked to the agreement. So our conclusion for both countries was that, you know, improved consumer safety and the quality of their products could be anticipated and basically in the long run, longer than a 5 years period. Now, regulatory approximation, which is another heavy task for this study, and there are really a number of areas, and I really don't want to I don't know, go into too much technicalities or bore you with that. But I very much invite you to actually have a look at the studies if you are curious about it, because this has a lot of different sectors. As I said, we have basically also put forward the legislative approximation inventories. These are the Excel files where we track the progress per each category. Obviously, the results are mixed. Overall, in a nutshell, what I can say is that the progress is quite significant in all the areas, including SPS, TBT, energy. I mean, this covers a lot of different areas, public procurements as well. But this is very much work in progress. And the question is to what extent these laws are implemented. One thing is approximation, another one is implementation. And during our stakeholders consultations, we definitely saw that there could be more progress achieved in terms of implementation, which is basically next step, which means full implementation of the agreement will definitely mean the full implementation of all the laws that are already approximated by Georgia and Moldova. And let me go to the sustainable development, because these agreements have this major addition, which is TSD chapter, so the trade sustainable the development, which is very important because it's very much fits and reflects the EU's policy in general on sustainability, so that we only build the trade with sustainable practices and we do not compromise sustainability on that. Again, for both of the countries, what we found in a nutshell is that the agreements really pushed thinking systematically and also introducing some sustainability standards across many sectors and many areas. But again, more to be seen as these countries proceed and progress with the implementation. So there are the laws now in place in a number of areas, but again, implementation remains challenging. Among many factors, particularly on Moldova's side, we can already flag the limited budget resources, lack of institutional and expert capacities, and simply a need for more EU support to local civil servants, because this is very new topics and new legislation for them. So that requires a lot of investment of human capital and the other institutional resources, which is challenging particularly for Moldova, but also for Georgia in terms of implementation. I think that's it. What I wanted. The other parts, I don't think I have time to that much time to go through it. What I can say is the unemployment rates are very high for both of the countries, and so is the poverty. We are speaking roughly around 1/5 of the population, which is either unemployed or lives under the poverty, and the situation is just really not changed significantly. So that's overall what basically you see on this slide, and it's also very, very difficult to link and single out direct effects of the agreement on this, because these are very much linked to the overall economic situation and domestic economic policies of these two countries. So there is definitely a constraint to how much we could single out the effects of the DCFTAs to this end. So we also studied the gender aspects of it. Employment in particular, we considered employment effects, female entrepreneurship, consumption effects, and the revenue effects. On the revenue effects, no particular evidence of the effects of the DCFTAs. Consumption effects, we actually found that the DCFTAs contributed positively to decreasing prices of goods and services that are most likely consumed by females in both of the countries. On the female entrepreneurship, we found a bit of deterioration in the business ownership across females, but that has been started before entry into the force of the DCFTA, so we could not link that as to the effects of the agreements. In terms of employment effects, I mean, the sectors which have high shares in female employment have only been marginally affected by the DCFTAs, and the other sectors, basically the gains to the other sectors were higher, and the benefits were accrued more to men than to females. But again, difference, particularly in the CGA modeling, is not that significant. We also analyzed the environment and all the effects that agreements had on a number of environmental aspects. Maybe the ones I would single out here are the effects we could find in the CGA modeling estimate. So marginal positive impact from the DCFTA leading around 0.02% decrease in CO2 emissions, and a bit more in the decrease of the CO2 emissions in Moldova. So it's 0.11%. This is just simply very important. So there is a sum, very minuscule, but still there is a progress to this direction. So that's I wanted to single out. But again, that is a very extensive chapter. I invite all of you to actually read about it. And then business environment, investment climate, maybe a few words on that. So Georgia has had a number of reforms before signing the agreement, actually, to root out the corruption, to reform the economies, to invite more FDIs. So Georgia's scores and rankings are quite high, and this has been continuation. So, I mean, the CFTA could only benefit, but again, it's very difficult to find the direct effects on it. On Moldova's side, there was some cycles in the business environment because of several, economic issues and political turbulence the country faced. Basically, and this is very much intertwined, to what extent we can benefit from the DCFTA also depends to what extent country can have a very proper domestic economic policies. And on Moldova, I mean, given the rankings and all that, one of our recommendations was to increase the efforts to actually root out the corruption. This is the part that would really contribute positively to improving business environment. And again, this has to be done, I think, by Moldova. The DCFTA can contribute to it, but the systemic reforms should actually come from the country, so that then the country can reap the benefits of the DCFTAs. That's the way we see it in terms of the process. And also we had a separate chapter on the human rights that we wanted to then link to the trade. What we found is that the right to the highest level of physical and mental health care has actually primarily improved because of more funding received by these two countries, because of more funding allocated by these two countries actually into the healthcare system, and also by the revenues generated from trade with the EU, but it's only indirectly, especially for Moldova, because trade has been expanding, so contribution to the GDP then indirectly could translate into that. So the SMEs have not yet been reaping the full benefits offered by the DCFTA. This was very much paralleled with the other studies, with the other parts of our study on the stories on SMEs. We found that, yeah, there was some growth, but again, large companies have benefited more than the SMEs of the trade with the EU. So another factor of the human rights angle is to what extent have been natural resources have been used sufficiently well, and what was the effect of the DCFTA. So what we found that during this period is basically the logging has been increased, and also increased use of water supplies for irrigation purposes. So what we basically draw attention was that the natural resources should be simply managed more sufficiently. But again, the CFTA does not manage that part directly. It can indirectly affect that. Well, there is also the institutional setup, the way the DCFTAs are basically managed and daily practiced in these two countries. The institutions are fully put in place, what is foreseen under the agreements, and there is also institutional capacity covered by the DCFTAs. Is basically the challenging part, again, as I said, is the implementation of the EU legislation. And so this institutional setup is there, but the challenges remains there. To what extent it's, there is enough financial and human resources capacities, that institutional capacity is growing, and so the implementation is also progressing. But what is foreseen under the agreement, it is also in place. The challenging part is the quality of the implementation, basically. We also had the chapter on ex ante, and with the comparison of our findings to the ex ante study, because this is an ex post evaluation. And very briefly, in a nutshell, what I can say, ex ante assessment basically significantly overestimated economic and social impacts, and also slightly overstated environmental effects. These, again, you can see in numbers in our studies. We had the estimates with ex ante study that was led by a Coris, and also we had our numbers. But again, I think the expectations of the economic benefits of this trade agreement has been really high, but what we see in numbers, they're a bit more modest than it was anticipated in general. I think this is basically all I wanted to say. Maybe I think recommendations part, I've mostly covered it. With the conclusions, just to very briefly review, maybe just to put it into the framework as well. In terms of the effectiveness, basically what we gathered is that DCFTAs effects through trade and economic relations and legislative approximations and legislative approximation, I mean, it was overall effective in terms of achieving the key objectives of the agreements. In terms of efficiency, we find it's moderately efficient, taking into account basically all the trade dynamics, also the trade diversion, and the use of preferences. That's what we took into account to define efficiency, and that was moderately efficient. In terms of coherence and relevance, let me summarize them together. We found that they're basically, obviously, the agreements are coherent and relevant to the needs of EU, as well as Georgia and Moldova. However, we also find the agreements to be slightly outdated, because the EU's trade policy has been actually evolving, and so was EU's legislation, and there is a bit of lag. If you read the agreements, there are a number of areas where annexes could definitely be updated, particularly on the services trade, digital single market, European Green Deal. This is where there is kind of lag. And obviously these agreements have been negotiated earlier than they were signed. So this is very much of reality. And as I said earlier, services trade is something that probably agreement should focus more, given the structures of economies of Georgia and Moldova. And this is also the sector where these DCFTAs have not focused so far. So this could be probably a next step of, easing the trade between the parties. And let me stop here. Let me thank you all for your very much patience with me. I will just show this slide. We have the obviously the website for the studies, also the functioning mailbox, and I also include my contact information in case you have any questions. I will be there to come back to you. And with this, let me thank you very much for your patience, and I'm very much ready for the questions.
Thank you very much, Tina, for this comprehensive, evaluation of the deep comprehensive free trade agreement between EU and Georgia and Moldova. I learned a lot. It was actually 1 hour. I think you must be also tired to answer to our questions. But we have the audience. We have people from our institute, people also from other parts, from European Parliament, from Austrian ministries, from Austrian industries as well. So let me open the floor for questions, and afterwards I will also raise my question. If anyone would like to ask a question, please unmute yourself, or you can at least raise your hands first so that I can invite you to ask the question. Until then, if not, I will pose some comments and question myself. It was a comprehensive study. I feel that there were the background and the backbone was CG modeling, which had, of course, different kinds of data that was fed to this model. So the first thing that came to my mind, and which I thought was missing in the presentation, was the evolving tariffs or non-tariff barriers, or how they evolved, because you mentioned that there was a trade liberalization already from 2000 since Georgia joined the WTO. But I wanted to see how tariffs were evolved. You said it was unilateral. I wanted to see if there was any difference for European Union after the signing of the DCFTA. So that's one thing, how tariffs evolve for both countries. And second, I think this, improves the presentation and also improves the study if there's a need for revision of the study. Then what was somehow surprising to me was that the trade with EU, between Georgia and EU, it did not change, and also there was no diversion effect or deflection effect for other countries that were not part of the agreement. So what came to my mind was maybe as trade we see it as the whole, maybe there was no change for Georgia and EU, but maybe the structure of trade changed over time. Because assuming that, so what is the, I'm thinking about what is the benefits of a DCFTA, that we would like to have other countries also in the neighborhood to join the EU in the future, and if they want to have DCFTA with the EU, what is the what is the ending outcome of your study? Does it make sense to say that Georgia didn't have better trade, more trade with the EU, so other countries that we will have in the future, they will not also have different kind of trade with the EU after they sign an agreement because they already are liberalized? Or maybe we can say that the structure of trade has changed. Maybe there are more technologically advanced sectors that are exported to Georgia that managed to somehow improve the ICT sector, as you also mentioned. Maybe these are the changes through this agreement. So I think maybe if you show a structure of trade or a structure of the economy, maybe we could have a better understanding of this point. So first, maybe you can respond to this, and then we can see if anyone has any question.
Sure, I think these are very, very valid questions. Let me also flag here. So Georgia joined the WTO 2000 and Moldova 2001. So that's just to clarify more precise terms. Let me start from the last question, Mahdi, because the other ones I still have to look for the figures. For the question you had, why should we sign the DCFTAs and what actually has been the benefit? I think this is the question we should start talking while discussing the effects. The thing is, the DCFTA or any type of trade agreement cannot really do away miracles in terms of trade unless the countries themselves have the economies which can produce and which can then export. So for Georgia's case, simply the country is very much import dependent. And so, as I said, for Georgia's case, 40% comes on the services. There is not much production actually going on. Even in agricultural, it's like we're talking about really, really small farmers. There is not an economies of scale, and Georgia also does not have a land border with the European Union, which makes the transportation also costly. There is a border via Black Sea, meaning most of the Georgia's goods are sent to Bulgaria and Romania via the Black Sea, via shipping. That has been a common practice, but the land border obviously would help. So that is one thing. So the limitation comes from the country's economic structure itself. So if the country is more advanced in manufacturing, then obviously they can boost their trade if they have tariff or non-tariff barriers with the EU. This is one thing. With Moldova's case, what we see, the country is bordering Romania, and most of the trade, up to 60%, actually the entry point is Romania. So Moldova really was helped by the bordering Romania, but also beyond the actual border, the language that these two countries speak. I mean, Romanian is the language in Moldova, and we see also from the trade literature that speaking the same language is simply helpful. So I would say it really depends what is the context, what is the economic structure, and what is the context and the geographical situation that also fits in to enable actually reaping the benefits of the agreements. Now, the other things I wanted to say is that these kind of comprehensive agreements come with really heavy annexes, as I referred to them in the PowerPoints, and really heavy commitments to approximate EU's legislation. Because, I mean, we're talking about two countries, Georgia and Moldova, which have had in place cost standards, Sovietic standards. So they had to disinvest from here and then basically have a new standards. It's extremely costly because we're speaking about up to 30,000 of regulations, directives. It's thousands and thousands. And that is quite costly for them. That requires time and approximation wise, and implementation is another story. So maybe just to give you an example, and so these kind of agreements yield benefits longer run after this process is fully basically done. Just to give an example here, while talking to the business representatives in the interviews we conducted with the stakeholders, for instance, one of the case with Georgia was even with the trading of raw materials, for instance, hazelnuts, they have to satisfy the SPS standards, right? So there is a single laboratory in Georgia that could be in line with the EU standards, so they cannot test it within the country. So what happens, they send the hazelnuts, but we don't talk about 1 or 2 kilograms, like 50 tons, right? To Bulgaria, and then Bulgaria, or the entry point, which is usually Bulgaria, checks into the EU level laboratory, and the hazelnuts can be actually sent back because they do not satisfy the standards, which is extremely costly for the businesses. So full compliance with the EU standards in terms of SPS and TBT, which is non-tariff barriers, I think are really the key for these agreements to actually reap the benefits of them. And this is really a lengthy process and a costly process. So we just identified what basically needs to be done. And this requires also extended EU support, because this is again linked to a number of costs. But yeah, that's basically what I wanted to say here. But in general, as I said, the main benefits of the DCFTA was this TSD chapter, sustainability, basically articles on that. Again, as I said, implementation of that is very challenging for these two countries, given the lack of financial human resources. However, if these agreements didn't come in place, these countries would simply, delay that, even thinking about it, even taking some steps, because, why would you do it, right? So that agreements actually bring these good commitments for the long run. Again, all I can say is the long run, the benefits should be just simply better for the other countries, whether they should sign it or not. Again, if they want to come closer to the European Union, I think these agreements are key, because they set the setting stone to come in line with the EU standards, which is really, really the key to boost the trade with the European Union. And maybe, Mahdi, I will stop here. I see the raising hand. Maybe we go to the other question. Yes,
Robert, please.
Well, thank you very much for this very comprehensive overview of the DCFTA and the implications of that. I think that the natural question from now on is, in particular on your last slide in the conclusions, that there are some current needs to update it and to improve it further. And as you said also in this response, that there are some lacking parts. Of course, we're now in a completely different geopolitical situation, given this brutal war of Russia against Ukraine. Where also now Moldova is affected already with some kind of electricity problems and so on and so forth. So, it's more a question of, because I haven't followed that in depth, are there any chances that this will be further negotiated, or some in-depth negotiations are still already going on? It's not a question about your study, which I find very comprehensive, very good and well done, and capturing a lot of things, and I think all things. But I really wondered about the future aspects, whether you know something about the actual status and what do you think might be the next steps then, because we had these discussions as well on accession status of Moldova and Georgia, and of course Ukraine and so on. And what do you think is the follow-up steps from here on?
Sure. I think this is also a very, very important question to actually see the broader picture. Why should we bother at all? The updating of the annexes is foreseen by the agreement. So the agreements foresee dynamic approximation with the EU laws, which means if there is a change into the EU law, which is put into the annex, that's the approximation. It should be changed. The annex should be basically updated. So that is foreseen. But the thing is, this updating of the annexes so far has been only done for Moldova, also has been done for Ukraine, but not with Georgia. On Moldova's case, the annexes on the digital, to be actually precise, the chapter on electronic communications and information society. These are two chapters of the agreement that are linked to one annex, and that annex has been updated with the new EU laws on the digital, basically on electronic communication. This was one precedent, but it's also a very bureaucratic process. So this has to be agreed basically and ratified then with all the member states. So because this is agreement between Moldova and Georgia with all the EU member states. So this is why I think my impression is, the updating of the annexes was relatively slower than it should be, because EU legislations have really, really moved forward. And one of our recommendations is really to reap the benefits of dynamic approximation and really update the annexes, and also revise the reservations EU has in trade and services. Now, this is before we speak about the changed geopolitical situation and outbreak of the war. Now, what the outbreak of the war has meant for Moldova, Moldova has received a candidate status, and Georgia has received a European perspective, to be very precise, which means that there are conditions. If Georgia fulfills it, then we can talk about candidacy. But for both of the countries to track their progress on the conditions set out by the European Commission, there will be review and assessment from the European Commission side. And the first assessment will be by the end of this year, and the assessment will come on what is the progress and what is the current state of play in terms of adopting the EU laws. Now, this is very important. So we see that for becoming a candidate country, obviously, association agreement is very important and implementation of it is extremely important. So that part, our studies will also, I think, feed into very well, especially with our legislative approximation inventories. And what we basically see is that for any political decisions, this setting stone should be there. I mean, EU enlargement is a political decision, right? This is not really merely economic. As I said, EU's economic interests are not high. I mean, economically, these countries have very minuscule role for the European Union. But so far, the implementation of DCFTAs and AAs have really the key role to steer these political processes, and we see that already this year, and we will see what will be the basically the assessment. So to put it back to Mahdi's question, why do we need to sign the agreements? As I said, this is beyond economy, beyond trade. It's simply to extend and enhance integration with the European Union, including, political cooperation. It's a setting stone. Now, with the other question, I think Robert had whether, or in general, whether these agreements lose their importance as the country becomes candidate country. Moldova's case, not really, and we see that in this basically assessments. What could be the next steps for Moldova or for Georgia if Georgia receives the candidacy? Well, again, these agreements will still be of the key importance because, as we can see from the past experiences of EU's enlargement with Western Balkans, it's really a lengthy process. It may take years, and also to draw a parallel with the Western Balkans, the European Union had association stabilization agreements, which are less comprehensive than association agreements and deep and comprehensive free trade areas. So these countries are actually one step forward already in terms of even adopting the EU laws. So these countries could go even faster given the legislative approximation with the EU. So I don't see these agreements losing really the importance. That will be actually probably the main steering forward. And given the lengthy process of the enlargement, it's very hard to actually see what exactly will have more importance than these ones. The priorities that the European Commission put forward for the three countries, including Georgia, are very much focused on the EU fundamentals, which is a political criteria of the EU membership, not so much economic parts, that is for sure, neither so much the administrative part, it's political part. But again, these agreements have a good setting stone for the further political cooperation. So I don't see the importance dropping here, and simply more focus will be on the implementation of the priorities that Commission has put forward. What we also know, the assessment of the candidacy will be done, final assessment by the end of 2023. So we basically have one whole year to go, and we'll basically see. I don't actually know whether I answered your question, because that was very much a bit interdisciplinary. I don't know if I did not. Please come back to me.
No, thank you very much. I think this is very, very good answer, and on all my very vague questions about that.
No, the question was not vague. It just really entails a lot of components, I think. That's also when I a bit struggle with that.
So let me ask you some further questions. So you mentioned that about 1/5 to 1/4 of population live under poverty, and the unemployment rate is very high, about 17%. So the DCFTA did not manage to change these issues. And usually in European Union, the member states receive funds from other countries or from the European Union budget. Do you think such a kind of funding to Georgia or Moldova should be somehow initiated in an expansive way before any other steps towards their accession to the EU starts? How is the amount of funding, or how is the support right now? Because you mentioned also that there are some regulatory issues. The countries do not have even laboratory to have conformity assessment behind the borders, so maybe there could be even some funding from the EU, that especially that your report is prepared for the DG Trade, maybe there could be some recommendation to give some kind of funding to these countries in order to circumvent these kinds of challenges. And at least it not only removes barriers to trade, but also it can increase employment in these countries.
No, I think this is a very good question, Mahdi, although I think this requires the knowledge of, legally speaking, whether EU can do that. I do not recall any case whether EU has provided these funds to the non-EU member states. And usually, as we know, EU is very much, based on its legal framework. So I don't know whether this is legally feasible. Anything that could help dropping the unemployment and reducing poverty for these countries is definitely significant, because, as also flagged, I think, by the Commissioner on the enlargement, Oliver Varhelyi, the main gap between the European Union and the candidate countries or its neighbors comes on economy. And I think we all know that. So anything that could reduce the gap could be very, very important and helpful. However, knowing the structures of these economies, when I think myself, whether funds, providing funds solely could do much in terms of sustainable, recovery from poverty or unemployment, I don't actually think so, because we cannot simply, inject the money into the economy. What I see happening or needed to happen is really implementation of the proper economic policies. So, for instance, building laboratories is one aspect that could be very good, and that's where I definitely see EU supporting its via its financial support that has been happening with all its neighbors, that it has some framework, political or economic cooperation framework with. So that is very much much visible, and that could be done definitely to boost the trade to this respect. But the other ones is really it's to drop to Georgia also to think of how to reach any economies of scale, if that is possible, or how to exploit simply services trade further. And this has to be mapped, has to be done, and then obviously you can provide some technical support, can provide some financial support in a tailored manner. But without having a strategic approach or economic policy, I don't think just injecting the money would do much in a that can be maybe very good in a pandemic, when we have a very much short needs, emergency needs, but that cannot change the structure of economy. And we are talking about structural issues here. When it comes to Moldova, basically the same trends apply there. Moldova has a further issue that because of the bordering Romania, and a lot of people also have Romanian passports, Moldova has unfortunately witnessed a lot of outflow of the workers and population to the European Union, exactly because of the poverty and because of very low salaries and wages. So that is something, again, structural issues, structural phenomenon, and the country needs itself to develop proper economic policy. In the ICT sphere, for instance, I bring that as an example. Moldova has put forward ICT parks. That was useful because it brought some businesses in the country, mobilized actually some SMEs. We had some investments picking up in that sector. So, and also a very good example is Georgia itself, with this unilateral trade liberalization, opening up, really focusing on attracting the investments. That actually paid off, and Georgia's investments have been really expanding over the years. So basically my point is, whenever these countries make some progress on redesigning their economic policies and having a strategic approach, we do see the outcomes in the numbers. And this is why I don't see just only by influx of the money we can do much. This is really up to the economic policies.
Great. So another question, Gunther, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. I have to be frank and open. I was observing as well the football match, but I went to both the studies. Left-hand side I do have Moldavia, and on the right-hand side I do have Georgia. You talked about FDI, so I'm really surprised. I can see Chinese money there, but if you go to Moldova, to Georgia, and if you talk to people from Georgia, and I'm working on the George Marshall Center in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, where we just finished a 9 weeks course with students from 25 countries. So for Georgia, I got the impression China is there.
Well, China is everywhere, but so when we pick up the numbers, where are the major FDI investors, so 60% in Georgia, the FDIs are linked to the countries I've presented. I can quote them: UK, Cyprus, Netherlands, obviously, and I think there is another one, Malta. Now, Cyprus, Malta, that is big question marks where actually the money comes from. Netherlands and the UK, these are linked to the construction of the pipelines, and they're the major ones. Now, what China has been doing, China has included Georgia in its One Belt and One Road initiative. And indeed, there was the readiness to invest more in building the infrastructure in Georgia. However, this is, again, very much linked into the country's internal policy. I don't know whether there is this big discussion on the Anaklia port construction that has been stopped in the country. That was foreseen to actually attract a lot of investments, including from China, but that has been on hold. The Black Sea port is there. So far, the key player here is actually Turkey, not so much investing in infrastructure, but being a major trade partner, exploiting that Black Sea port and the trade. But China's investments per se and in the infrastructure in Georgia are not that high for the moment. China is there. It has been growing, I think, but in terms of numbers, I cannot quote so much. And again, because Georgia has been a bit slow on opening up for the further investments that have not already been in place. Let me also flag that Georgia has indeed the FTA with China and also Hong Kong. that refers also to the bilateral relations in investments. So that has been strategized and put in place. We just do not see that much in terms of numbers, not yet. So we will see how how China actually expands in the region.
And Moldova, so there can see China as well. And on the other hand, we learned from your presentation, and I can see on the slide, the heavy investment from Russia, Cyprus coming into Moldova, and how it is in Georgia. So maybe you can talk about the two issues.
No, so the investments in Georgia from Russia directly are not significant. But again, let me question where the money from Cyprus and Malta actually come from. We don't know that. This is simply not trackable. That could be Russian money influx, but simply we cannot. So we don't know. With the Russian investments, as I said, it's larger in Moldova than in Georgia. And Russia's relations with Georgia were a bit, not a bit, but a lot affected with a lot of trade embargoes and political, relations. So that was not really expected to see much of Russian money influx in actually investments. And also, given the Russian economy itself, that has been not really growing much before the war. I mean, that was their strategy and aim. Yeah, that was not really foreseen to receive much Russian money in Georgia. Well, other than maybe some other directly other sources, Malta or Cyprus.
Yeah, thank you. Gunter, any other question? Thank you. So, thank you, Tina. It was a very well presentation. It's 1.5 hours after the session started. I'm sure you became so tired. Robert, applaud you. And I learned a lot from the two countries and also from the DCFTA between EU and these two countries. Thank you again for accepting our invitation and giving us a nice presentation of your study. And thanks everyone for joining us today. And I hope you also liked the presentation as I did. So after this seminar, you will receive one email for sending your evaluation. I hope you can do that. And I wish you best of luck. Next week, we will also have another presentation, another seminar, which will be related to trade and the World Trade Organization. So I hope I can see some of you also in that seminar as well. Thank you very much, Tina. It was nice to meet you here again. And I hope and wish you a nice evening.
Many thanks, Mahdi, for having me. It was my pleasure.
Thank you. Bye.